My daughter tried to sell everything I'd built. What she didn't know was, I was about to show her the power of what she was trying to take. Let us know where you are watching from before we jump into the video. Let's get started. The gravel crunched under expensive tires as Sarah's black sedan pulled into our driveway, dust settling like a fine veil over the windshield. I stood at the kitchen window, my fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic of my coffee cup, watching my daughter emerge from her car with the confident stride of someone who owned the world. 7 years. 7 years since she'd last set foot on this land that had shaped every memory of her childhood. Her heels clicked against the stone pathway John had laid 40 years ago, each step echoing with a purpose I couldn't yet name. She wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than what most folks in town made in a month, her hair pulled back in that severe style she'd adopted since moving to the city. The sight of her should have filled me with joy, my only child, my Sarah, finally home. Instead, something cold settled in my chest like morning frost. She knocked on the door she'd once burst through with scraped knees and grass-stained clothes, now waiting like a stranger for permission to enter her childhood home. When I opened it, her smile was practiced, professional. "Hello, Mother," she said, not Mom or Mama like she used to call me, but Mother. Formal and distant as the space between us. The embrace she offered felt rehearsed, her designer perfume foreign against my simple cotton dress. I breathed in, hoping to catch a trace of the little girl who used to help me gather eggs, but found only the scent of ambition and expensive things. "You look well," she said, her eyes already scanning past me into the house, cataloging, evaluating, calculating. As I led her into the kitchen, I noticed how her gaze lingered on the hand-painted tiles John had surprised me with for our 20th anniversary. The way she examined the worn wooden table, where we'd shared thousands of meals. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. Not nostalgia, but something sharper, more clinical. "We need to talk," she said, settling into the chair where her father used to read his morning paper. And suddenly I understood that this wasn't a homecoming at all. Sarah pulled out her laptop with the efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling conversations, the silver surface reflecting the afternoon light streaming through our kitchen windows. Her fingers moved across the keys with practiced precision, and I could see numbers dancing across the screen. Figures that made her eyes brighten with the kind of excitement I once saw when she discovered lightning bugs in our garden. "Mother, I've been thinking about your situation," she began, her voice carrying that tone she probably used in boardrooms, patient but condescending. "This place is too much for you to manage alone. The maintenance costs, the property taxes. It's not sustainable at your age." Each word felt like a small stone thrown at glass, creating tiny fractures in something precious. She turned the laptop toward me, revealing photographs of our farm that she must have taken from real estate websites, along with projected sale prices that made my breath catch. The numbers seemed impossibly large, yet somehow they reduced everything John and I had built to mere dollars and cents. "With the coastal development boom, this property could sell for enough to set you up comfortably in a nice assisted living facility," she continued, her enthusiasm building with each syllable. I stared at the screen, seeing our morning coffee spot on the porch reduced to prime waterfront footage, our vegetable garden labeled as buildable acreage. The old oak tree where John had proposed 53 years ago was noted as mature landscaping, potential removal for optimal development. My hands trembled slightly as I set down my coffee cup, the gentle clink against the saucer the only sound in the kitchen. "Sarah," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "This isn't just property. This is home." But she was already clicking to the next slide, showing floor plans for luxury condominiums, her eyes bright with visions of profit margins and return on investment. In that moment, I realized that my daughter, my baby girl who used to beg me to read just one more story before bedtime, saw our family legacy as nothing more than an undervalued asset waiting to be liquidated. That night, after Sarah had retreated to her old bedroom, now converted to my sewing room, I found myself walking through the house in the gentle darkness, my bare feet knowing every creak in the floorboards. Each room whispered its stories. The living room where we'd watched Sarah take her first steps, the study where John had taught her to tie fishing flies, the kitchen where 3 generations of women had kneaded bread and shared secrets. I paused at the dining room hutch, my fingers tracing the carved wooden frame that held our family photographs. There was Sarah at 5, gap-toothed and grinning beside the prize-winning tomatoes we'd grown together. At 10, proudly displaying the blue ribbon her 4-H calf had won at the county fair. At 17, radiant in her graduation cap, John and me flanking her with faces full of pride and possibility. When had that bright, connected child become this stranger who spoke of our life in terms of square footage and market value? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its familiar rhythm a comfort that had anchored me through grief, loneliness, and now this new kind of heartbreak. I climbed the stairs to the attic, pulling the chain that illuminated the dusty sanctuary, where John and I had stored our most precious memories. Boxes lined the walls, each one labeled in my careful handwriting. Sarah's baby clothes, John's military service, farm records 1962 present. I opened the box marked legal documents, my fingers finding the envelope I'd placed there decades ago and forgotten. The deed to our property, yes, but something more. Papers John had insisted we file shortly after Sarah was born. Documents that established our homestead as a protected family trust. Just in case, he'd said with that quiet foresight that had guided so many of his decisions. Sometimes the most important protection is the kind nobody knows you have. As I read through the yellowed pages by the light of the single bulb, understanding dawned like sunrise over our fields. John's love had extended even into this moment, providing a shield I hadn't known existed. Our farm wasn't just property that could be sold on a whim. It was legally protected as a generational homestead, requiring unanimous family consent and a cooling-off period for any sale. My husband's wisdom had given me something more valuable than money: the power to protect what truly mattered. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as I prepared breakfast, my movements deliberate and peaceful despite the storm brewing in my heart. Sarah appeared at 7 sharp, already dressed in another expensive suit, her phone pressed to her ear as she conducted business with someone about property acquisition timelines. She gestured for coffee while continuing her conversation, treating our kitchen like her personal office space. "Yes, I understand the market conditions," she was saying, her voice carrying that authoritative tone that had probably intimidated countless employees. "But family properties often come with emotional complications. I'm handling those now." She ended the call and turned to me with an expectant smile, as if I were a problem she'd already solved in her mind. I set her coffee down gently and returned to my own cup, letting the silence stretch between us like morning shadows across our fields. When she pulled out a folder thick with legal documents, sale contracts, realtor agreements, investor proposals, I felt that familiar calm that had carried me through my husband's final illness and the lonely years that followed. "I've prepared everything, Mother. You just need to sign here, here, and initial there," she said, pointing with her gold pen. "Sarah," I said, my voice carrying a quiet strength she hadn't heard in years, "before we discuss selling our home, there's something you should know about your father's planning." I rose from the table and retrieved the folder I'd brought down from the attic, placing it beside her glossy documents. Her confident expression wavered as I opened it to reveal the trust papers, the legal protections John had established decades before her birth. As she read through the documents, I watched her face change from confusion to disbelief to something approaching fear. "This can't be right," she whispered, her polished composure cracking like ice in spring. "You can't just. This property belongs to the family trust, not to you individually." I nodded, pouring myself another cup of coffee with hands that had never been steadier. "Your father was many things, sweetheart, but he was never careless about protecting what mattered most." For 3 days, Sarah paced our house like a caged animal, her phone constantly buzzing with calls from investors, lawyers, and real estate agents whose dreams of easy profit were suddenly complicated by what she called legal technicalities. I watched her frustration build as she realized that our simple farm was protected by layers of legal wisdom she'd never suspected existed. "This is ridiculous, Mother," she said over dinner on the 4th evening, pushing around the pot roast I'd made, the same recipe that had been her favorite as a child. "You're sitting on a fortune, and you're letting legal paperwork from the 70s keep you trapped in poverty." Her words stung, but they also revealed how little she understood about true wealth. To her, our morning coffee ritual on the porch was worthless. The garden where I grew vegetables for half the elderly folks in town was just empty acreage. The peace I'd found in these walls after John's death was simply stagnation. She began bringing potential buyers to the house without asking, strangers who walked through our rooms with measuring tapes and calculators, discussing renovation potential and tear-down options, as if I weren't standing right there. I served them coffee and cookies, watching their eyes light up when they saw our waterfront access and mature trees, listening to them plan the destruction of everything John and I had built with our own hands. "The old woman seems attached to the place," one developer whispered to Sarah as they stood in our living room, probably thinking I couldn't hear from the kitchen. But once she understands the financial benefits, sentiment usually gives way to practicality. Sarah's laugh, bright and conspiratorial, cut through me like winter wind. My own daughter, agreeing that my love for our home was merely sentiment to be overcome. That evening, I called my old friend Margaret, who'd worked as a paralegal before retiring. "Maggie," I said, my voice steady despite the sadness weighing on my chest, "I think it's time I understood exactly what protections John put in place." Her voice was warm and familiar as she promised to review our trust documents. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the people who love us most are the ones who see trouble coming before we do." As I hung up the phone, I realized that John's foresight hadn't just been about legal protection. It had been about preserving my right to choose. My daughter might have forgotten the lessons we taught her about respect and family, but my husband had ensured that forgetting wouldn't cost me everything I held dear. Margaret arrived the next morning with her reading glasses and a legal pad, spreading our trust documents across the dining room table, like pieces of a puzzle finally ready to be solved. Sarah had left early for meetings with investors, her car kicking up dust as she sped toward town, leaving me alone with the truth I'd been slowly uncovering. "Oh, Helen," Margaret breathed as she read through John's carefully crafted protections. "Your husband was brilliant. This isn't just a family trust. It's a conservation easement combined with a homestead protection that makes this property nearly impossible to develop." Her finger traced the legal language that John had insisted on including, protections for the farmland, the shoreline, even the old oak trees that had sheltered our family for generations. We spent the morning identifying every safeguard John had established. The requirement for unanimous family consent, the mandatory 1-year waiting period for any sale, the provision that gave me lifetime residence rights regardless of ownership changes. But most importantly, the clause that made Sarah's hurried investor meetings meaningless. Any sale of the property had to be approved by the County Conservation Board, a process that could take years and often resulted in denial for properties with historical and environmental significance like ours. As Margaret explained each protection, I felt something awakening in me that had been dormant since John's death. Not just understanding, but power. Real power, the kind that comes from being prepared for battles you didn't even know were coming. I made copies of every document, filed them in my own secure box, and began to understand that my husband's love had given me something more precious than security: the ability to stand firm in my own choices. That afternoon, I walked our property lines with new eyes, seeing not just the land I loved, but the legacy John had protected with legal precision. The trust required that any development preserve the farmhouse, maintain public shoreline access, and protect the wetlands that supported migrating birds. Sarah's luxury development dreams weren't just impractical, they were legally impossible. When she returned that evening with more investors in tow, I greeted them with coffee and the quiet confidence of someone who finally understood her own strength. They could measure and calculate all they wanted. The law was on my side, and more importantly, so was love. The kind of love that thinks 50 years ahead and builds protection that endures long after the person who created it is gone. Sarah's frustration had transformed into something darker by the second week of her visit. She'd hired a lawyer, a sharp young man from the city who wore expensive suits and spoke about breaking outdated trusts and proving diminished capacity. They sat at our kitchen table, this stranger and my daughter, discussing me as if I weren't pouring their coffee, planning strategies to declare me unfit to make decisions about my own life. "The documents are old," the lawyer was saying, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged. "Courts today prioritize family financial interests over sentimental attachments to property. We can argue that maintaining this farm is against your mother's best interests." Sarah nodded eagerly, her eyes bright with the possibility of victory. I listened from the pantry, arranging preserves with steady hands while they plotted the legal destruction of everything John had built to protect me. They scheduled medical evaluations, competency tests, financial assessments, a battery of examinations designed to prove that a 74-year-old widow couldn't possibly understand her own best interests. "Once we establish guardianship," Sarah said to her lawyer, "the trust provisions become irrelevant." That evening, I called my old friend Robert Shin, who'd served as John's lawyer for 30 years before retiring. His voice was sharp with anger when I explained what Sarah was planning. "Helen, that trust is ironclad. John anticipated every possible challenge, including family pressure and competency questions. But you need to document everything. Every conversation, every visitor, every attempt to pressure you. The trust has provisions for exactly this situation." As I hung up the phone, I realized that this wasn't just about property anymore. My daughter was willing to have me declared incompetent, to strip away my dignity and autonomy, all for money she didn't even need. The little girl who used to promise she'd take care of me when I got old had grown into a woman who saw my independence as an obstacle to overcome. But John's protections ran deeper than even I had known. And tomorrow I would begin to show Sarah exactly what kind of strength she'd forgotten runs in our family. The morning of Sarah's scheduled competency evaluation, I dressed carefully in my best blue dress, the one John always said brought out my eyes, and braided my silver hair with the same precision I'd used to braid Sarah's when she was small. Dr. Morrison, the physician Sarah had hired, arrived with a briefcase full of tests and the confident air of someone performing a routine task. I served him coffee in our best china, and answered his questions with the patience of someone who'd spent decades teaching Sunday school. When he asked me to count backwards from 100 by sevens, I complied with a gentle smile. When he requested I explain my daily routine, I described my morning walks, my vegetable garden, the meals I prepared for elderly neighbors who could no longer cook for themselves. "Mrs. Patterson," he said finally, closing his folder with obvious reluctance, "you show no signs of cognitive decline. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning sound, and your daily functioning exemplary." Sarah's face went white as he continued. "Furthermore, I notice you maintain detailed financial records, manage your own medication schedule, and demonstrate clear understanding of complex legal documents. Any court would find you fully competent." After he left, Sarah turned to me with desperation, replacing her earlier confidence. "Mother, please. Just think about what you're giving up. The money from this sale could secure your future, could give you luxuries you've never imagined." But I was already moving toward the dining room hutch, retrieving the folder that contained not just the trust documents, but something else, something I'd hoped never to need. "Sarah," I said, settling across from her at the table where we'd shared so many meals, "your father didn't just protect this farm. He protected me." I opened the folder to reveal John's military commendations, his Purple Heart, and beneath them, my own certificates, master's degree in education, decades of teaching awards, and the papers documenting my work as a financial advisor before I chose to focus on family. We weren't simple farm folk, sweetheart. We chose this simple life because we understood what truly matters. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the grandfather clock marking moments that felt suspended in time. Sarah stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, finally seeing the parents she'd reduced to rustic caricatures in her mind. "I don't understand," she whispered, and I realized that in trying to transcend her roots, she'd lost sight of how deep and strong those roots actually were. The next morning brought unexpected visitors, 3 couples from the city, all around Sarah's age, all carrying the kind of eager enthusiasm that comes with checking items off a bucket list. Sarah had arranged what she called a Heritage Farm Experience tour, complete with printed brochures describing our authentic rural lifestyle and my traditional farmhouse cooking. I was meant to be the entertainment. "Mother, just play along," Sarah whispered as the couples climbed out of their expensive cars, cameras already in hand. "They're paying good money for this authentic experience." She dressed me in what she considered farm-appropriate clothes, a checkered apron and worn jeans that felt like a costume, transforming me into a character in her rural fantasy. I served them coffee and watched as they photographed our kitchen like it was a museum exhibit. Listened to Sarah explain our quaint traditions and simple values with the authority of someone describing a culture she'd never truly understood. They asked me scripted questions about the old ways, treating my life like a historical reenactment rather than a living reality. But when one gentleman asked about the property's history, something in his genuine curiosity touched the teacher I'd once been. I began to speak, not about quaint traditions but about soil conservation techniques John had pioneered, about the native species we'd protected, about the sustainable farming practices that had kept our land productive for decades. Sarah's face grew pale as I mentioned my background in agricultural education, my work with the County Extension Office, my role in establishing the Regional Conservation Program. You developed the watershed protection model that's used throughout the state? The woman asked, her respect evident in her tone. I nodded, explaining how John and I had combined his military engineering background with my education credentials to create farming methods that had been adopted by universities. Sarah stood frozen as her paying customers realized they'd expected to patronize a simple farm wife, and instead found themselves in the presence of recognized experts in sustainable agriculture. When the tour ended and the visitors left with genuine admiration for our work, Sarah confronted me with hurt and confusion. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, her professional mask finally slipping to reveal the lost child underneath. "Because," I said gently, "you never asked. You decided who we were without wondering who we'd always been." 2 months after Sarah's lawyer admitted defeat and her investors moved on to easier targets, I found my daughter sitting on our porch swing at dawn, still in her pajamas, watching the sun paint our fields gold. She'd been staying with us since her apartment lease expired, not because she had to, but because she'd finally remembered what she'd lost when she stopped coming home. "I used to love mornings here," she said quietly as I settled beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "I'd forgotten how the light changes everything, makes even ordinary moments feel sacred." Her voice carried a gentleness I hadn't heard since she was young, before ambition had hardened her edges and success had isolated her from the people who'd shaped her heart. We sat in comfortable silence, watching our neighbor's cattle move slowly across the distant pasture, listening to the gentle rhythm of waves against our shoreline. "I'm sorry, Mama," she finally whispered, using the name she'd abandoned years ago. "I thought I was saving you from something, but I was really just afraid. Afraid that if I admitted this place mattered to me, I'd have to face how far I'd drifted from who I used to be." She'd started helping in the garden, her manicured hands learning again how to coax life from soil, her expensive clothes gradually replaced by the comfortable jeans and cotton shirts that suited our rhythm of life. The woman who'd arrived with plans to liquidate our legacy was slowly remembering the girl who'd once promised to carry it forward. "I want to learn," she said one evening as we canned tomatoes together. "I want to understand what you and Dad built here, not to sell it, but to honor it." The healing came in small moments, Sarah asking for my biscuit recipe, the 2 of us mending the garden fence where John had taught her to use tools, quiet conversations about memory and meaning that stretched into the peaceful darkness. She'd taken a leave of absence from her corporate job, not to destroy our farm, but to rediscover the values that had shaped her before success had convinced her that love could be measured in dollars and worth could be calculated in market value. As autumn painted our trees in shades of gold and red, I watched my daughter truly come home, not to the place she'd outgrown, but to the person she'd forgotten she could be. Some things, I realized, are too precious to sell, too important to abandon, and too sacred to reduce to their material worth. Our farm would remain what it had always been, not an asset to be liquidated, but a legacy to be treasured, protected, and passed forward with the same love and wisdom that had kept it safe through all the storms that had threatened to wash it away. If this story touched your heart, you're not alone. So many of us have felt dismissed, underestimated, or pressured to give up the things that matter most to us. Sometimes the quietest strength is the most powerful, and sometimes the love that protects us works in ways we never expect. Subscribe for more stories that honor the wisdom of our elders and celebrate the strength found in unexpected places. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their worth isn't measured by others' understanding, and that sometimes the most important victories happen not in boardrooms, but in the gentle persistence of knowing your own value.